Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Markus Schulz, who's working on a new book, Mexican Mediascapes in Transition. Welcome to Rip Rap, Markus.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much for inviting me here to your program. It's a pleasure to be here.
Markus, your book project evokes some very interesting questions about the way global diffusion of the digital world we call the Internet can have profound social consequences, especially when there's the dimension of what you call digital inequality. Perhaps you can first set the stage and explain the focus on one social movement, the Zapatista insurgency in Mexico. What was the immediate situation that caught your attention?
Well, Jim, I had a long-standing interest in researching the preconditions for global democratic politics, the conditions under which people recognize one another as belonging to one and the same social world, sharing the same kind of problems. Then the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas had happened on January 1st, 1994, the very same day that NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Treaty, had taken effect. Approximately 3,000 rebels, indigenous Mayan peasants, tzotziles, tzeltales, mames, choles, tojolabales, many of them actually very poorly equipped with arms, had risen up in the southeasternmost state of Mexico, Chiapas. They occupied several towns, medium-sized towns, and San Cristobal de las Casas, which is a city of 100,000 inhabitants and an internationally well-known tourist center. This was something that had taken the world by surprise. Many people had predicted that NAFTA would be disastrous, but nobody expected that in Mexico there would be a guerrilla movement taking up the arms on that very same day. The rebels were protesting 500 years of exploitation, as they called it, since the time of the conquest until the time of the PRI regime in Mexico that had ruled Mexico for the last 70 years. They were protesting discrimination in society, discrimination of the indigenous in the courts. They were protesting their lack of land, their lack of access to education, to health. More generally, they were demanding liberty, were demanding justice, were demanding democracy.
So the global communication device of the Internet really helped them establish their community.
The Internet was a medium for the Zapatistas to reach out to a transnational audience, to an audience in Mexico City, but also in scores of countries around the world, in the United States, in Canada, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and so on. So this is something quite unprecedented. The ability of a small rebel group to be able to actually circumnavigate the government-controlled or corporate-controlled national media and get their messages out at full length in an uncensored kind of way. This constant flow of information that came out from Chiapas, reaching a transnational audience, helped to build the kind of latent ties over time that were then being mobilized for protest events in front of Mexican consulates, other symbolic places of importance, to create this kind of public opinion pressure that pushed the Mexican government to stop pursuing a military repressive solution to the conflict and rather to agree to a ceasefire and to start getting with the rebels onto the negotiation table. Their demands were perceived as being justified. It rang true to many supporters that they had been repressed for so many years, they had no legal redress, elections were rigged time and again, and they were living in abysmal poverty. So their message, their protest, touched a kind of a chord. And at the same time, what is very important here is that this is a guerrilla that had perhaps the potential in the past to embark on a more violent path, but they refrained from that and rather embraced a more moderate rhetoric, demanding democracy, demanding fair elections, demanding their right to be recognized citizens.
Well, and that's what I found fascinating with this notion of global diffusion, too, is that this was also an extension of how you use the digital world that we call the Internet. You also had this 6-volume work that's in German, but it's accessible to some people, about the Internet and politics in Latin America, and I imagine this grew out of that interest of looking at the political dynamics.
When I had investigated more the relationship between media and social movements, so I realized, well, here we have a subaltern actor that is actually succeeding in its survival, in getting out messages and so on, based on access to a high-tech medium. It's a very unusual case, however, because more often than not, marginal actors do not have this luck to find sympathetic supporters in the post-industrial world in cities such as San Francisco, places in Germany, where the supporters were setting up websites, maintaining all those emailing lists. The Zapatistas themselves, the armed rebels, they do actually not have, at least not at the time that the uprising initially had occurred. They didn't have any kind of laptops or satellite connections. This is just a legend, this is just a myth. So the images that envision Subkommandant Markus as being a cyberpunk was technically just not feasible. Messages were carried out on muleback or by foot to the next larger hamlet, and then from there by trucks to San Cristobal de las Casas, which is the major city, and then from there they were faxed into Mexico City, and then from there they would have then gotten onto the internet.
Well,
so
I didn't realize it was
connection.
that elaborate in order to get the message out. So they had to travel quite a distance in order to just get the message out on the internet.
But this showed to me that if subaltern actors are lucky enough to get access to a global information and communication infrastructure, they can completely change their political situation. The same also holds true in terms of economic opportunities. For instance, there was a cooperative of indigenous communities at the Costa Chica in Oaxaca that had specialized for generations on the production of honey. They used to always sell their whole honey production to a local intermediary who paid them a very small price. At one point, they ran in trouble with that local intermediary, but they were lucky enough to know somebody who had a connection to an NGO in Mexico City who knew how to navigate the internet, and they were able to locate a fair trade buyer, an NGO in Canada. So they contacted the NGO and they agreed to buy all their honey for that year and actually also offered them a contract for the following years. So this example illustrates how access to this global information infrastructure can help subaltern actors, marginalized groups of people, to circumnavigate those labyrinthine local power structures and improve their livelihood.
Well, as you put in your text, it's a way to attract and maintain that kind of access. So, like you were saying, otherwise, people that otherwise may not even know of your situation, you can post that on the internet and they can become aware of it.
But of course, we also have to be careful because, in a sense, the Zapatista uprising and their use of the new media was something that caught their opponents, the Mexican government, by surprise. The opponents, in the meantime, also learned. They also can set up their websites and counter the propaganda war on that very same level. In 1994, the internet had been quite young, so there weren't as many websites out there yet as today. Today, those websites might be more easily drowned in the flood of information. So Coca-Cola gets many more hits than hits on the webpage of the Zapatistas, which I think by now is about exceeding 5 million hits the main page.
Oh. And have you done any analysis as far as the kinds of people who are following the Zapatistas or becoming involved, as far as the kinds of audiences or communities that are interested?
The audience is and the supporters is a very diverse group. The greatest supporter base is, of course, in Mexico City, but here the interesting thing is that on behalf of the Zapatistas, they are marching on the Zócalo not only indigenous Mexicans who, let's say, would identify based on racial status with the rebels, but also non-indigenous Mexicans. Not only peasants, but also urban dwellers. So it is a kind of alliance that goes across the lines of class, of ethnicity status. But what's most interesting in this case is that they also were able to mobilize a support base abroad in other countries, among New Yorkers, among people in San Francisco, in Germany, and other places in Europe. New York Zapatistas, for instance, many of them are students, but others are workers. So it is a very diverse kind of group.
Has this role of this more activist sense for the function for the internet, has that been sustained since that initial impulse that the Zapatistas developed?
It's a very good question, because one could have expected that a lot had to do with maybe just exotic excitement, projecting something onto the rebels that wouldn't really hold fast to the reality on the ground. But interestingly enough, when I analyzed the sheer volume of information, of emails being sent on the topic of the Zapatista case, then I saw year after year several thousand of emails were being generated. And so this information flow was over the years relatively constant. So it showed it was not just a fad that would wither away very quickly. The Zapatistas had been declared dead, well, ever since they rose up in arms, and the Mexican government initially had tried to impose their view of the rebels as being just a bunch of ignorant indios, which were manipulated by foreigners, suggesting guerrilla from Guatemala, El Salvador, or Nicaragua. But because of the internet, so they were able to go around the framing that the government had tried to impose. But in the meantime, there was also a transition in the larger political landscape in Mexico. The party that had ruled Mexico for more than 70 years, the PRI regime, was then eventually defeated at the ballots, and a president was elected who came from the opposition. It was not the leftist opposition that the Zapatistas would have preferred, but it was the more Catholic, right-of-center opposition that came to power through the election of President Fox. However, alternation in the party who is bringing the candidate who is being the new president is one of the key ingredients for a democracy, that you have to have this alteration in power. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. You also need to have an opening in the media. But in the 1990s, there had also been a significant shift within, especially first in the print media landscape. Most newspapers had followed for decades the line of the government without critique and so on, through a very complicated system of subsidy, of newsprint, bribes, more or less open, more or less regular. But since the mid-1980s, you also had a couple of newspapermen, a couple of entrepreneurs who risked their fortune to maintain an independent newspaper. And on a national level, those newspapers were actually even more important than the internet. The internet's importance was on the transnational, on a global level. It was in 2001 that I first saw Subcomandante Markus actually appearing on national television in a full-fledged interview. So much has changed in Mexico since the time that the rebels had risen up in arms. So you could say a lot of their initial goals were already fulfilled, and so far that you have tremendous progress towards democracy. So in one sense, the enemy has disappeared because it's no longer this authoritarian PRI regime, but there are possibilities to work now by using the vote. But on the other hand, also some constitutional amendments have been made, constitutional changes that give more rights to the indigenous. It is much less than the indigenous rebels would have hoped for, much less than their full expectations of having their cultural rights being recognized, and especially to get access to a piece of land.
I think it's really fascinating that essentially a communication process, like the global media, could enable the kind of discourse that you were talking about. The emails back and forth means that people are talking to each other, trying to understand concepts, and that could result in some kind of productive political process. And what are some of the other implications of forming these networks of communication resistance as part of this incipient global civil society?
I see in this a kind of a possibility for creating from the grassroots a kind of global civil society. Benedict Anderson had argued in his work that the print media were crucial in bringing about nations as imagined communities of people imagining to belong to one another, something that triggers then solidarity. Marshall McLuhan had argued that it's the electronic media, he thought mainly about the radio, television, would bring about a global village, a global kind of community. So the notion of a global village has experienced now with the rise of the internet a kind of a renaissance. We no longer believe that the print media or television will bring about a universal reconciliation among humankind, since we already have witnessed how those media are all being used for war propaganda, for anything but bringing about peace. But on the other hand, I think we also need to be much more skeptical of the potential of the internet. To be sure, I do see those great opportunities. It is an interactive medium, rather a medium that sends out, that broadcasts a message from a powerful station to many millions of consumers. It is an interactive medium. However, when I did empirical research on the emailing listservs and so on, and was actually looking to what extent is the medium being used for sustaining a kind of well-arced dialogue, I was rather disappointed to see that more often than not, what happens is just the repetition of a message, or just sending a message by error, or just flaming. So the potential of the medium is not being fully used.
What were the methods you used for your research? You said you checked out the emails and listservs?
Yeah, I looked at websites, and I looked at several listservs, especially Chiapas 95 and Chiapas L. Those are listservs that were maintained based in Austin, Texas, and in Southern California. So locations that had traditionally ties to Mexico. Those are university centers where you have educated groups of students who donated a lot of their free time. So for the first year or first year and a half, the Zapatista movement, you could say, had a lead in cyberspace. At this time, the Mexican government hadn't had a proper website yet. But over time, a government can, of course, outspend any small rebel group.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the key concepts in your book project is the notion of a mediascape. And maybe you could explain what you mean by that and how that works.
By mediascape, it is an artificial word that brings together medium and the notion of a landscape. I think when we analyze media, we have to analyze them as being all part of a landscape in which they are intertwined. It's a kind of a whole media ecology, where each medium creates a kind of public, but all those publics, they're intertwined with one another. I think the very visuality of networks, the internet, consists of networked computers. And those cables that connect the computers, they suggest with all their powerful visuality that the public has the shape of networks, but the shape of networks that constantly change the way in which they are configured. So we have to, I think, abandon the old question of whether the public is declining or whether it has already declined or whether it will very soon decline, that we have to abandon this type of question in favor of a question that rather tries to investigate how publics are constantly reconfiguring themselves, how they are transmuting themselves over time. Publics constantly decay, but they also constantly re-emerge. A public may decline, but a social movement actor may emerge that brings about or appropriates a kind of a new medium and creates a new public.
When I was thinking about that, I also was thinking about how there's been research about new technologies, and that there's an impression, I think, in the general public that when a new technology is coming in, it's going to completely replace all the previous, and that's not exactly the pattern. That you'll have a new technology comes in, and then you have this blending process where it establishes itself. But there's still, I mean, you know, when television came, then everyone thought newspapers were just going to go out of existence. And when the internet came, they thought, well, then everything else, and it really, what happens is you have this blending where we still have newspapers, still have magazines, we still have television, and we have the internet. And so I think that there's this kind of scanning, or like you were talking about, we have to get a sense of, in certain places, what is the media that are available and what are the uses that the people there are using of them.
We might see in the near future a convergence between different types of media, especially maybe audiovisual media like television with the internet, but all the high tech will not replace the face-to-face meetings, will not replace, let's say, the grassroots meetings in the church basement.
Right. You did raise a very troubling dilemma about the global mediascape. And you talked a little bit about that, this hope of some kind of global utopia and a new age of global cooperation. But there are other uses like increasing commercialization and expanding surveillance and cyber warfare. I think of China that has placed, I think, censorship devices on its servers. So, I mean, there's some really troubling things that are happening also.
The Chinese government is very scared that the dissidents are using the internet as a medium to organize the opposition movement. So they try to curtail the use, but at the same time, they also want to see the internet being used for economic benefits. It would very much hurt the Chinese economy if they crack down on it. So they are in a dilemma.
You have the cyber warfare. What do you mean by cyber warfare?
Well, this is a controversial kind of concept. Many people had actually called the activities of the Zapatistas as a kind of a cyber war. Ronfeld and Aquila, for instance, researchers with the Santa Monica-based think tank RAND Corporation that often works for the Pentagon, had suggested that this is a new type of warfare that the United States has to militarily prepare itself. However, during the Iraq War, during the war on the Balkans, I did not really see any kind of sustained threat arising out of this. Of course, one has to prepare infrastructure with a good firewall against viruses and so on. But the argument of some was that it was an exaggerated kind of fear that was rather being used in increasing the budget, create jobs within the Pentagon or related think tank to do something about it. So there is a suggestion that it might have been an exaggerated kind of fear. But on the other hand, what we see here in the development of new surveillance technologies, this is something that undermines the notion of privacy. It undermines the ability of citizens to control who is collecting data about them. But I would actually see the danger not just coming out from what George Orwell called the big brother, a big brother government, but I would also see the danger of corporations gathering far too much information about citizens, about users, about consumers. In the United States, consumers are not as much protected as, for instance, in the European Union.
What do you see happening as far as the legacy of this new Mediascape? Where do you think it's going to be going?
I don't believe in technological determinism. I don't believe that there is in the technology built in a kind of automatism that it will lead in this direction with some sort of necessity. I do believe that technology is something that is socially shaped by a diverse set of heterogeneous actors. It is in part the geniuses, the inventors who invent the technology of a computer, who create new software code. But it's also the entrepreneurs, the big corporations that distribute, that manufacture, that market the new hardware, the new software. It is also the legislators who are writing new laws about what can be done, what is allowed, what is not allowed, that are regulating to what extent there can be a merger between different media organizations. They are the courts, there are the politicians, the lobby groups. And of course, there are also the users. They're the consumers that vote with their purchasing power whether they want to buy a certain product or prefer a different product. Okay. And there are, finally, also the initiatives coming out of social movements, of NGOs, sometimes policy initiatives, where they are demanding that their government would, let's say, do something in terms of creating more universal access.
Well, one of the points you make is that people around the world have a social right to share in shaping the social dimension of the global mediascape. And I thought that was interesting, because we can get lost into the corporate world and all these other demands going on. But I think that's quite an interesting point to make right now.
In the latter half of the 1990s, in the United States was a big debate about the so-called digital divide. I think this concept is very misleading, because it suggests that there is a divide in those kind of binary categories, those who have access and those who don't have access to the information wealth. But I think the picture is much more fuzzy, it's much more blurred, because there are degrees of access. Not just access in terms of broad bandwidth versus more narrow bandwidth. It has also something to do with the navigational skills.
Well, it certainly is fascinating work, and I appreciated you being able to come on our program and share some of these insights. Thanks for being on RipRap.
Thank you, Jim. My pleasure.